welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. Today we have on Elizabeth Cobbs. She holds the Melbourne Glasscock Chair in American History at Texas A&M University. She's a prize-winning historian, novelist, and documentary filmmaker. She's the author of the Hello Girls, America's First Women Soldiers, American Umpire, The Hamilton Affair, and The Tubman Command. And her newest book, available now, is called Fearless Women, Feminist Patriots from Abigail Adams to Beyonce. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you.
Well, and so before we begin, I just want to first say something and give a shout out to my friend Elaine, who's an avid podcast or an avid listener of our podcast, not just an avid podcast listener. So she actually bought your book on Harriet Tubman because she loves Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman is like her favorite historical figure ever. So she was really excited to get into that. So I want to just, shout out to Elaine. Okay, so as we usually start, I'm going to read a passage from Lisa's book. So Lisa wrote, satirist Jonathan Swift, author of Gulliver's Travels, urged young women in 1723 to cultivate their intelligence, without which it is impossible to acquire or preserve the friendship and esteem of a wise man, who wanted a true friend through every stage of his life. John Adams enjoyed such a partnership with Abigail. For women of the era, it took extraordinary strength to swim against the tide. Abigail Adams scrutinized the books of leading thinkers for encouraging words and stubbornly insisted, as she put it, that females inherit an equal share of curiosity with the other sex. She pointed out to a friend that James Fordyce acknowledged the most conscientious men are, in general, those who have the greatest regard for women of reputation and talents. Despite views that raise hackles today, Enlightenment writers represented new ways of thinking, Abigail believed. Indeed, depictions of women as vain but pleasant dimwits were, in some respects, a genuine improvement. So can we now get into a little bit about the history about feminist thought, and especially now since you started the book with Abigail Adams and Abigail Bailey. So can we talk about a little bit about their lives and how they were, in some sense, revolutionaries and kind of trendsetters, right? Especially in terms of what was sort of established and what the norms were around just the relationships with the different genders at the times and especially when we think about the expectations for women then.
Yeah, that's such a, I thank you for coming to that quote. Often we're just terrible fools because, I mean, you search for a phrase sometimes, and sometimes, most of the time you're just out there grinding it out, but every now and again you think, no, that's it. Vain but pleasant dimwits was the way women were thought of by many men, most men, not all, of course.
Right.
Even someone like John Adams, he would say, well, I like to talk to you, Abigail, but our son Thomas, he just talks with girls, and what's he going to learn there? And then he goes, oh, I'm not supposed to say that. Oops. So it's so funny. All the things we think of as being so modern, a woman saying, I really don't like how that sounds. And a guy saying, oh, well, don't be so prickly. And we look back now and we think that, everything we're about is, we are inventing, even like feminism, which really is invented, I think, historically speaking, in the United States at the time of the American Revolution. Now, even today, we kind of go back and forth. Well, is that person's a feminist or if they're not a feminist? And like there's some, biochemistry definition that if we get all the molecules lined up right, that is a feminist. It's not. Just has always meant what Abigail said, which is we should not be treated as the vassals of your sex. Vassals, not a modern word, peasants, slaves, serfs, whatever, underlings, Übermenschen, Undermenschen, whatever. And so Abigail was really that. And it starts here, friends, because of that first idea that you can have a broad popular government, that one man should not be over all other men. So what I found so fascinating to think about, and I just think it's really true the more I look at it, is that the attack on patriarchy starts with men attacking patriarchy. Because second sons and third sons would say, well, why do I get less? Because I'm not the firstborn. Or, barons saying to King John back in the Magna Carta days, well, wait a minute, why is your blood, your royal blood, so much more important than mine? So that's where it starts. And then for someone like Abigail Adams, she's a smart cookie, very smart. And she goes, well, if not one man can rule all men, then why should all men rule all women? What's the justification for that?
Mhm. Yeah, and then so just to because I want to kind of get into what their lives were like, I really appreciated the first chapter especially. So what was so interesting about that is that you had these two contrasts with Abigail Adams and Abigail Bailey. So with Adams, obviously, she had a much more pleasant relationship with her husband, as opposed to obviously in this case the contrast, the different relationship that Abigail Bailey had with her husband. So kind of can we talk about how both women came to sort of feminist or their feminist ideals, and also kind of how their backgrounds were contrasted with one another, and maybe how their backgrounds even inform some of their thinking?
Well, yeah, in each chapter, one thing I've tried to do is I have what I call a person in my mind I think of as the face of feminism, somebody that said something or did something that we today would recognize as an effort to stand up for the rights of women or for equality as a principle. And then I always have somebody who's like, well, like, why should we care? Because I think that there is a bit of this, and you see this in all movements where there's people who are in a more privileged situation look back and say, well, are those people just kind of whining? Are they just like, I broke my fingernail,
Mhm.
oops. And so I think it's really important. It helps us if we understand why people of the day thought laws should change. We need to look at what was happening in the day that allowed even people then to go, you know what, that's not right. That's not right. And I can see that. So Abigail Bailey, to your point, my new friend, is a person who suffered from what were known as the Coverture laws, which affected all married women, which was that by the laws of England, which then become the laws of the new United States, women ceased to exist. I know that sounds like weird. Like you're like, wait a minute, hello. I don't think they ceased to exist. No, actually, in law, they ceased to exist when they became married. They were covered, as that's why it's called coverture. They were covered by their husband's legal identity. They could not even get in trouble by themselves. Like if a woman broke a law, they'd say, oh, well, let's go talk to her husband because we know her husband put her up to it. A woman had no way of doing anything. So Abigail Bailey was a woman who had 17 children. And her husband, who was a Revolutionary War veteran and well-esteemed man, a major in the American Revolutionary Army, was also a tyrant at home. And he abused his wife and he abused his children, and he was a sexual predator. He forced, we think, she testified, women that worked in their household. But then when he got in trouble for that with the township, he then turned to assaulting their daughters, at least one. And now the thing is, if Abigail Bailey had said, okay, I'm enough of this, I'm divorcing you, under the laws of coverture, the husband owned all the children. All the children belonged to the husband. So if she got a separation from her husband, he would take all of the girls as well as all of the boys, and they would be even more completely under his control. Also, if she tried to just like go to the cops, or the colonial version of the cops, what could happen there, and what the law read in some places, was that if it was shown that the father had sexually assaulted a daughter, that the daughter would be culpable too, and could even to prison sentences, even death by hanging. And in some places, we've all heard about Hester Prynne had to wear the scarlet letter on her blouse for the rest of her life. An incest victim would have to wear the letter I sewn onto his blouse for the rest of their life to show that this person had participated in this. So the laws were so cruel, not intentionally, but were. And so that was the kind of thing that Abigail Adams, we never met Abigail Bailey that we know, but that's what she was referring to when she said, and she even said, kind of to your point, Alan, she said, I know not all men are this way. Most men are not this way. But why put it in law that a man who is a tyrant can, with impunity, is what Abigail Adams said. Our foremother, Abigail Adams, said, why let them treat us with impunity?
It's insane to me, if I'm not mistaken as well. Even if her husband passed away, the property, it wouldn't go to her, right? It would go to the children, right? She didn't even have that kind of right.
Yeah. Craziness, Leon's, because think of this, in that era, up through the mid 19th century until like the last quarter of the 19th century, if a man died, all of his property went to the children. Now, laws have been liberalized by Americans so that they took away early on, this was Thomas Jefferson, primogeniture, which was the idea that the first son got all the lion's share of everything. So they'd even that out. around the time of the American Revolution, shortly thereafter, state laws changed to allow all children to share equally, but not the wife. So a woman had no right to live in her own home upon the death of her husband. Now, undoubtedly, many children would have said, oh, no, stay, or I'll move my wife and children in, and mom, you can have this garret in the attic and maybe do some cooking for us. Who knows? Every family is different, but the law, and that's what we're talking about, the law treated these women as beyond their shelf life, wait out the rest of your life on our sufferance.
Yeah, I really appreciated Abigail Bailey's story just from a more personal perspective. So a lot of what she went through sort of reminded me about kind of my own upbringing. I don't really necessarily love talking about this, but it just, so in terms of the way our culture is, it's actually, or at least the way it was, it's not so much anymore here in the US. It's very similar to the way kind of, I hate this stuff. Okay. So it was very similar to the way the Soviet Union culture was. So a lot of the ways sort of the women in our kind of sort of communities grew up it was pretty much in this sort of way that Abigail Bailey grew up. And sort of the understanding was there was a lot of blaming themselves, and there was a lot of pretty much shaming themselves. And obviously the community would do so in turn too, right? Or you can even argue that the community did it and it was turned inwardly. So when I was growing up with my mom, I mean, she had just a series of relationships, which is a bunch of bad guys. So I had what's a stepfather who was a pretty bad dude. He was pretty much in command of the house. It was pretty much his way or the highway. There was nothing that anybody could really say to him. And then just a lot of the women in our family, they grew up in the same ways. So when I'm reading Abigail Bailey's story, so not as intense, I would say, as my own childhood, but not that dissimilar either. So you kind of see some of the sort of remnants of that, or some of the reflections of that in her story of what I went through. And so it's also very similar. There's a lot of explaining away. There's a lot of excuses. There's a lot of thinking, well, if I just get better, or if I just shape up, maybe my husband will finally see me and accept me. Maybe he will finally love me. So it's so, I guess, interesting and kind of scary that she went through this, especially as the story kind of goes on in the chapter. And she's, kind of near death in some ways with him, where he takes her on this trip. And that's obvious. I want to get into that because it's a great part of the story. And she's terrified, right? And I remember thinking that my mom went through the same thing with my stepdad. So there was a point where essentially she did finally have enough. And it became really bad because for him, he just decided, well, you're not going to leave. I'm not going to allow that to happen. I actually need you, right? I'm not going to get into the specifics of why, just because it's a legal thing and, who knows where that could go, but whatever. So he's like, I'm not going to let you leave, essentially. And then so she said, well, I need to do this for me and my kid. I can't have you around anymore. And yeah, man. And the way the system works, and this is something I definitely want to touch on a little bit later, but the way the system works is just, it's not really great here now going, from the Soviet Union to the US. It's not really great toward women still. And here's how. So my stepdad at the time, he sort of, he went to the police and he said, well, my wife hit me, right? And he had a scratch on his face. And so because there was a domestic violence incident before, what happened was that actually my mom called the cops on him. And so because there was a point where it was like he got really out of control and we didn't know what to do. So my mom calls the cops, right? The cops come. Essentially, we kind of explained it away and we're like, it's not really that big of a deal. You don't have to arrest him. Just let him stay here, whatever, right? So what happens is at that point, my mom, the second time, so now he goes to the cops actually arrest her the second time. And so the question was, well, why are you arresting her? There's no, first of all, this didn't happen, but fine, maybe, point aside, there's no evidence of that happening. And so they say, well, it doesn't necessarily matter because there was a domestic incident before. And my point was like, yes, but she was the one who called on him. And the cop says to me, he says, well, it doesn't actually matter who called on who because there was a domestic incident. Now we have to actually book her and keep her overnight. And this was over the weekend. Yeah. So just really, really wild stuff. And so just, again, we'll maybe touch on this a little bit later because I really want to touch on Abigail Bailey's story, is that it's so insane how the laws work against women, because here's this person who's reaching out to the authorities and saying, hey, I need help. And then in turn, they say, well, it sounds like you're actually part of the problem. But yeah, but just going back now to Abigail, do you want to
just super quick, just to that point, it's interesting that I mean, not interesting, but I should say that things like this are still an issue, right?
Yeah.
This is not just like in the context of, the late 1700s, early 1800s or anything like that. These are still modern day issues, right? Like, even these roles that some women are still in, for example, like that tradition, which by the way, there's nothing wrong with having that, let's say, traditional housewife role, or maybe, as the woman, I'm gonna do these tasks, and as the man, you do this, blah blah blah. Sure, but on another level, it's just like coming from that culture, right? Like also I have a sort of like a Ukrainian, Russian sort of background. My own mom also was just sort of, I wouldn't say subservient, but it's almost as if like it's not like she exercised her sovereignty and trying to maybe get her own job or something like that. She just kind of took that traditional role,
Yes,
and it's almost like imposed
it
essentially
is.
still in that culture.
Yeah.
Um,
And it is. And so the women in that culture, I mean, just because I want everybody to know this, that it's incredibly hard to start working because there's nobody actually pushing you to go to school. That wasn't even necessarily a thing in their time.
Well,
yes.
I mean, one of the points I make in this first chapter is I tried to create a scaffolding in the book to show how women gradually acquired rights in the United States and in many countries, but the focus is on the US. But those first rights, the first two chapters, one is the right to learn, like literally just the right to go to high school. And the second chapter is the right to speak. That is literally speak in the company of men, literally open your mouth and say something other than Alleluia. Because by the way, you were allowed to sing in church, but not anything else. So those are two rights that women don't have in many countries today. Malala, the famous face of female resistance in our time, was a girl who was shot in the head because she wanted to do what Abigail Adams fought so hard for, which is the right of girls to go to high school. And the right to speak is something that women still do not have in many countries where they have to be veiled and are not allowed out in public. So it's recent, friends, as you know, and you know from your own families. And I, by the way, relate to that, Alan. If you got a chance to read my book all the way, which is rather long, all the way to the end. I mean, I had a family situation too, very similar, which, I think MeToo is letting us all know, listen, if we want to get a first abuse-free generation, then the generation that we're all a part of right now has to just start saying, hey, this happens to everybody, or not everybody. Fortunately, thank goodness, not everybody. Happens to a lot. And how can we deal with that? How can we just stand up unashamed and say, as you just did, as I'm doing now, this is part of our histories. But it is old. It's old stuff, and we're still all wrestling it with as a species.
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
can we get into a little bit about Abigail Bailey and then her story, because that was so fascinating, just how she got through it, and it's sort of the sort of type of Sophie's choice that she had to make toward the end.
Yeah. So, oh my gosh, this is so hard because a perpetrator of violence in a family is always trying to make the other people look like it was their idea, their fault, that they're collaborators, that they didn't speak up fast enough. That meant that they're just as guilty. And so, like your mom, right? You reported, but you didn't report it in the right way, at the right time, with the right detail, et cetera. And so suddenly the person who's the primary victim really becomes the person who's on the spot. So Abigail Bailey, her husband, after she kicks him out, she can't really kick him out though, keep in mind, because even if they get a divorce, again, all the children, all the property go to him. So she kicks him out, but her daughter doesn't want to testify, because her daughter, by the way, probably doesn't want to go into a court trial where she could end up with a letter I on her shirt for the rest of her life, or maybe in trouble, because in those situations, if the child did not, the instant an incident happened, report it and go to the officials, the child was considered as culpable. And even then, there's a question of like, how hard did you resist? One girl in it was Massachusetts, in colonial Massachusetts, went to a trial, and her arm was almost broken, but she said, well, I almost broke my arm, but I consented in the end. Now that word, I consented in the end, meaning upon pain of death, I yielded to this thing that someone was trying to do to me. They threw out the case. Well, you consented. Okay, I guess we got that. So anyway, Abigail Bailey's so wonderful though, because he kidnaps her. He takes her, he promises some, well, I'm going to give you property if you go with me on this trip somewhere. And he basically kidnaps her and takes her, 250 miles, on horseback. And they have one horse, and they get there, and it's some backwater New York upstate town with like 3 tree stumps and a bazillion standing trees. And she catches smallpox there and almost dies. But then he says, I'm going to go back. They're from New Hampshire. I'm going to go back, and I'm going to finish up our business. What that means is that he can put the kids out for hire. So his prerogative as the sole custodial parent is to put the kids out to apprenticeships and to jobs where he can collect their wages until they're 18 and they become his. And he's going to go back and take care of all of that. And he leaves her behind. And she, by hook and by crook, and she's still sick from smallpox recovering, she gets on a horse, a lone woman with no money. I think she said she had 28.5 cents, because I guess you get hay pennies back there, half pennies. And she rides 230 miles back to New Hampshire by herself, crossing streams, going through the mountains, trying to find her way. And she gets there and surprises them. And she goes with her brothers to the sheriff or police or whatever, constable. And they force him. But the wonderful thing to see, guys, is that all these men want to help her. You know, the John Adamses, the average men of the world, they don't want to see a woman in this situation, but the law is not in her favor. And the attorney they go to says, well, gosh, yeah, it sounds bad, but, really is nothing I can do. Mm-hmm. And then he says something that makes her realize that it doesn't mean, though, that she can't use tricks, because that's all women had, or their supposed wiles, feminine wiles. So they can lie and they can cheat and they can use subterfuge. And that's what's granted to women, since law is not on their side. The custom is, if you are servile enough or tricky enough, passive aggressive enough, we would say today, that maybe you can get something. So she basically, comes up with a ruse where she threatens him and she gets another man to deliver the message, threatening some other guy who's now got the kids. It's a long story. It's complicated, but it is interesting to read, to see the lengths that, of course, any mother would go to save her children.
Right. And she essentially had to choose between the kids. This is sort of the climax of it, which was really wild. I mean, I can't even imagine what that was like for her.
Yeah. So, which kids can you rescue? Which kids can you not rescue? It's really tough. And the daughter, who's the primary victim of sexual assault, basically she just gets away with her life, and there's no justice there, but she lives, and that's a good outcome. And but the other thing that's interesting about this, because as a historian, we cannot make anything up. If we don't know it was raining, we can't say it was raining. We're just real sticklers that way. It's so important. It's our job to get the facts as unvarnished as we can get them and verifiable. But we're lucky, because she wrote, before her death, she wrote it all out. This terrible story that, of course, no mother wants to say to the public. But she felt some compulsion, and she was a literate woman. She did know how to read and write, and so she wrote it all down. And after her death, her pastor, the minister of her congregation, found it in her papers, and he thought, oh my gosh, what's this story? So he went around to have it verified. He talked to neighbors who did know, and he talked to her surviving children who did know, and they verified it. And the interesting thing is, he said, we're publishing this as scandalous it is, and cover your ears, those of you who can't, this is too much to say. He said, but we're writing all this because we want people to know that even in the worst circumstances, they can always rely upon God to sustain them through the worst things. And that is how Abigail felt. But of course, the next generation would say, as Abigail Adams did, why can't women rely on the law too?
Right. And it would seem like a necessity. I mean, because, maybe not the religious sort of sentiments here aside, but I mean, the idea of kind of God intervening, I would say any religious person would say, is pretty unlikely.
Or, I mean, they're right. There are all those explanations for what it all means and why humans are put to the test as they are. And, what is free will? And okay, let's not go down that rat hole.
Right. Right.
But that's the nature of American history. And that's 1776 all over, up and down. Which is, the law. We know life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, and protection of property need to be written into law, and you get to hold your government accountable for its ability or take them to account for their inability to enforce that law.
And what's insane to me, by the way, is some of the women featured in this book. I actually, not that I'm anyone in particular, but in school, I didn't learn about most of these women, actually. Like Phyllis Schlafly, the Grimke sisters. Like it was upon reading the book, I love that, I got to learn about these, even details about like Susan B. Anthony that I was not aware of at all, too. But it's insane that this isn't something that's, I guess, taught, or at least that I wasn't exposed to. I wonder how many people know about the figures in this book. It's really useful to learn about as far as that goes.
Well, thank you for that much. One of the things I put in the start of the book, like reasons to write the book, et cetera, is that, and it just irks me because I was actually on the jury once for the Pulitzer Prize in American history. So I know a little bit about the process. And in 106 years of the Pulitzer Prize for history, it has been given one time to a book on women's history, one time. And the book is it's wonderful, valuable, important book, really, really valuable book. And it's about midwifery. Now, that's a great book, not to run it down, but to say, so in 106 years, the only book on women that seemed to be appropriate was a book on reproduction. Like, like there's more going on there. So I think that there's this idea, kind of, Leon, that women's history, and this is Women's History Month, is kind of like a side dish, or maybe it's like a nice garnish on the main dish of American history. But when you actually put it together, and most of my books, by the way, have not been on women's history, I've written on kind of mainline American politics. But when you start to look at it, you realize so many aspects of how we operate as a country come out of this effort to push for greater equality for women, greater equality in general. And this is a driver. So women's history is not just like, the parsley or the, I don't know, whatever the more modern equivalent is of dressing. Oh, you help me out, but nasturtiums. It's not just something to make the plate look pretty.
Right. Absolutely. So I want to actually read another passage from your book, because I think this is a good, actually a great segue into our next topic. So in this passage, Lisa writes, while Beyonce bared her soul in her marriage, women around the country began at first, one by one, but soon in the tidal wave of testimonies, to make public their experiences of sexual harassment and rape, shining a spotlight on a problem that every generation had grappled with since Abigail Bailey threatened her husband with exposure and extricated herself from an abusive embrace. Americans once again found themselves shocked at the harms of sexism, as survivors spontaneously launched the MeToo campaign of 2017. Dedicated women and men, journalists especially, dug deep to uncover abuse in sports, at work, and in private life. Their effectiveness came from a bountiful harvest of evidence that assault and misconduct were still shockingly common and reached as high as the presidency. Why did some men consider these practices acceptable? Why did so many Americans look the other way? The public airing of such questions helped to denormalize abusive behavior. Once again, a new generation moved the nation closer to its founding aspirations. So I love that. And then I would ask, how are we sort of starting now to answer these questions, right? So why did some men consider these practices acceptable? And why did so many Americans look the other way? Because, I mean, right from the onset of your book, we're already getting to see that even with John Adams, as great as he was like, well, I like you guys, but I don't like you guys that much, right? And you kind of see that, even though we have this perception, just like with racism, that racism is a thing of the past, so is sexism as well. But it's often the case that it's not that it's the thing of the past, obviously. It's more so that it's kind of swept under the rug. So why do you think, in terms of, the kind of historical data, what does it tell us about some of the evidence about why some, and a lot of men do prefer to look the other way?
Well, there's this old statement, where you stand depends on where you sit. And if you have a comfortable seat, you don't have to stand up for things. And I think that it's partly human nature. I mean, we have lots of evidence that, if a person is in a situation of privilege, it's always easier to minimize the damages that other people experience, not to walk in their shoes. In the case of gender, I think it's race to some extent too, but it's different. But in gender, there's always been a fairly profound cleavage that goes back in all cultures. So in that sense, it precedes issues of race, because long before humans started to, walk out of different continents and onto other ones, or get on ships and, sail the seas, you've had this very profound distinction between the genders. And so I think, anyone in a situation of privilege tends to do that. And what happens, as we know, I mean, you sound like you experienced this in your own family, Alan, is that because it's so normalized, the person in less power tends to believe, oh, I am actually just not as entitled as you are to those privileges. And so it's my job to do my job and to, work within the constraints that we have. And so people put themselves down. But in a while, by the way, a friend of mine read this book, who's an editor, he's not an author, but he's an editor, so reads a lot. And he says, this was the most optimistic book I've read in 2 years. Like, oh gosh, first of all, people don't like optimism. It doesn't sell that well. But I think that is the story. The story is that the three of us are sitting here having this conversation. And this conversation was not possible 50 years ago. And so all of these things, there is a scaffolding of rights, but some of the last rights, like the right to safety, which is the one I explore in my 8th chapter, the last chapter, the right to safety, we have not gotten very far on. I mean, the right to vote, like, well, we get up there and we slide back a little bit. There's voter suppression, but, it's all in all, mostly women can vote, mostly Black people can vote, et cetera. But when it comes to violence, we've made very, very, very little progress. The CDC just last week released statistics showing that child abuse and rape of people, women in America are most susceptible to rape between the ages of 7 and 17. That's when the majority of people are raped for the first time. So we don't have a good system, and we have yet to really commit. We have not really committed to making that a part of the history, our ancient history. So, these things, they take a while, and there's a lot that has changed, and I want to chart that, because I think if we take progress for granted, we lose it.
Yeah, and did you want to say something? So, and then and as you kind of continue that chapter, what we're talking about now is something like Fox News. And, I mean, I know this is going to upset some people, but I'm going to just say it. It's regressive, right? So a lot of Republican politics are pretty regressive. So what's so interesting is that we like to think of, so the famous quote is, the arc of justice. What was the quote? The arc of justice bends forward, or something along those lines. I forget what exactly it was.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, I think that's it. So, so the idea is that there's this linear progression to what we're doing, and we're constantly becoming better, and sort of every successive generation is much better than the next. And there's some truth to that. If you look at Steven Pinker's work, I mean, a lot of what we're going through and a lot of our, let's say a lot of the struggles that we've been through, I mean, some of them to some extent are alleviated. And if you look back and you map, I don't know, life through centuries, obviously we're way better than we were hundreds of years ago. But what's so interesting is that it's like we take kind of two step forwards and then like one step back, right? So you mentioned Gretchen Carlson, which I definitely want to talk about and get into her situation, how that kind of manifested with Roger Ailes and Fox News. And then what we're thinking about is more broad term or broader aspect of it, or more kind of long term, is we're thinking about now Donald Trump, the presidency. And to be honest with you, I remember when Trump was elected, I never thought that in my lifetime I would ever see something like that. I think all of us were so horrified because it sort of felt like we were, and obviously we didn't live through this period, but it felt like we were placed back into the 1950s, and even in a more abrasive way, because at least they were polite. These people were polite in the 1950s, so you didn't even expect it to be so kind of outwardly brazen. But what's so interesting is, again, going back to this notion of progress, regress now seems like, I mean, it's gotten at least a little better because now Biden's the president, and obviously things are sort of getting back to normal, whatever that is. But it's even still, we have like this section of American politics and this subsection of people who are now more outwardly sexist, right? So let's get into Gretchen Carlson and kind of her story and why that was so important for sparking the MeToo movement.
Yeah, and just before launching right into your story, I think that we are of two minds about these things, in my mind, Alan. I think that we tend to think, oh, onward, upward, and we sometimes criticize the teaching of American history as too much a story about, look how great we were, pat ourselves in the back. But I actually think we also suffer from the absolute opposite, which is to say, oh my God, this has never happened before. This is so terrible. This is so awful. I can't believe it. Like, everything's as racist as it ever was and as sexist as it ever was. Like, that's not true either. And so we need to be kind of grown up and sophisticated about these things. It's always true that there are no light switches in history. It does not, like, the light goes on or the light goes off. It's progress can always be reversed. It can be. That's why they had the Dark Ages. We'll talk about that in another podcast. But, they lost the recipe for cement. Ancient Rome had the recipe for cement, and then it got lost for about 1,000 years. So wow. It is possible to have significant regression in history, but it's also the case that we've had a lot of progress, which we need to protect and preserve and appreciate, as well as understand that it's not always going to go our way all the time, and people will always resist change. So Phyllis Schlafly is an example of that, but let's talk about Gretchen Carlson, because so here's a woman, she gets her dream job, which is to finally be an anchor on a major television news show. And she was working for Roger Ailes. And of all things, she happens to be a former Miss America. And now when she worked for CBS is like, let's not talk about that because everything is going to think you're just a dumb blonde. She's already blonde. So, they think you're a dumb blonde. So we just won't talk about that much. But Roger Ailes is like, whoa, nice. That's part of your street cred with our crowd. And but what happens is that she, as if you've seen the movie or follow the newspaper, she becomes the subject of sexual harassment by him, and sexual extortion. Really, if you do this, then you get that very explicit form of sexual harassment where it's a quid pro quo. And she doesn't yield to that, but she's punished for it, and she loses her job ultimately. And the interesting thing I think there is that Roger Ailes shows this trend in American history that starts a little earlier than that, starts in the 70s, where there's a kind of anti-feminism where feminists become the new boogeyman. I mean, it used to be, as you said, the Ruskies, or, now it's back to being the Russians again. But anyway, during the Cold War, it was, you blamed the communists under the bed, and then it became the feminists. And oh my gosh, the ways that feminism is described are ones that Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a staunch feminist, would never have recognized. But, feminists are Satan worshipers and, baby killers, and, there are all kinds of things. So Gretchen Carlson becomes, she's not just the victim of sexual harassment, but Roger Ailes keeps his, in a way, hand around the throat of women in his network by what I call feminist baiting them. Well, you got a problem because you're a feminist. Oh, no, Roger, I'm not a feminist. I just think you shouldn't be trying to, get into my pants. Oh yeah, but you're just a feminist. You're having a feminist. Are you having a feminist moment? Which almost sounds like, are you on your period and feeling cranky? So she, of course, does stand up to him quite famously. At she loses her job. She risks her entire career, and she never does. She never really rises again to that level in terms of broadcast journalism. But she does get a big payout from Fox News.
Yeah, and
sorry, just
go for it.
One thing that is actually very interesting now that we're talking about this. A lot of people have this conception in their mind when they classify somebody or they identify someone as a feminist, right? They have this picture they sort of paint in their mind of like, okay, this is someone who's staunch women's rights, and this sort of like black and white view of what that kind of person might look like. But there's something that you articulate in your book that I think is actually, that I'm not going to articulate very well, but I wanted to ask you, what kind of women are feminists? Because, for example, one thing I remember from the book is that women, for example, like some women who are feminists, for example, wanted the right to vote or the right to earn, right, essentially, but then also didn't necessarily want all of the rights. Like, for example, there were women like that. There were some feminists who were also racist, right? Others. And could you speak a little bit more on that? Like, what kind of women are feminists, just to give sort of a broader picture?
Sure. Well, Leon, I think that women and men who are feminists are people who accept as a basic principle that women deserve the same dignity and security, physical security and, right to opportunity that men have, which is to say the world isn't perfect for anybody, but the idea that there should be equality in those regards. And so that's why I use feminism in a very broad sense, in the same way that Thomas Jefferson famously said in 1801 in his inaugural speech, where he was trying to put out an olive branch to the Alexander Hamiltonians and, John Adamses of his world. And he said, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. What that meant is that we all believe in a united government, federalism. We all believe we're all Republicans, meaning we all believe in democracy, popular vote, and not having a monarchical form of government. So I think that today, if a Jeffersonian type person were around, I think the next Republican candidate or Democratic candidate needs to both, I hope, maybe two women will run. Wouldn't that be nice? Hey, if we get Kamala Harris and say Nikki Haley, we'll be taking race and gender off the table and just say, let's have a conversation here about what are the big issues. So, I think that's essentially what feminism is. And then, as you said, people will disagree, as we do on lots of things. We all believe in a democratic Republican form of government. We all believe in the unity of the 50 states, for the most part. And so let's just take that off the table. And I think that that's really what feminism is. It's not, and by the way, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a staunch feminist, opposed the Equal Rights Amendment, as did Phyllis Schlafly, who was both a feminist and an anti-feminist. there are women today, feminists, who oppose the right to abortion. There are many feminists who say, no, that's a fundamental part of reproductive rights, the right to life, liberty, and property, and right to happiness. So we are always going to disagree on the implementation of the principles that we hold together, but acknowledging that these are principles we hold together will enable us to have better conversations, rather than saying, well, you just don't even believe that the races are equal. And then that just people get more in their corners.
Yeah, and there's this other great passage where you write, the desire for belonging appears to belie the desire for autonomy. In Run the World, Beyonce sang, I hope you still like me, suggesting that even powerful girls want male approval. Such lyrics led some to question whether the songwriter could really call herself a feminist. One pundit wrote that Beyonce offered women little more than a banal brand of beginner feminism, expressed in inoffensive pro-girl anthems that failed to challenge trenchant gender ideals. Yet the critique itself was problematic. Were beginner feminists not cool enough for professional ones? Should inoffensive pro-girl anthems aim to be offensive instead? Must heterosexual women reject the gender ideal of marriage to win approval from self-satisfied censors? So I love that. So for a lot of times what happens with idealism, which is really great in its initial stages, it kind of becomes co-opted by extremism. And you sort of understand that because, I mean, obviously we kind of try to overcorrect for the reason that the problems are so extensive. And you think, we can't give up even a little bit, right? So it's like, if we're looking at sort of patriarchy and we're looking at patriotism, nationalism, chauvinism, we're looking at these sort of constructs and these social structures as really negative. So the thinking goes, if we're going to create a kind of more utopic society or a utopic society, we have to do away with them altogether. Obviously, that's not very realistic. And so here's what happens with someone like me. I actually don't really like extremism in any form, whether it's feminism, anti-racism, whatever it is, even though I actually do really like and admire Malcolm X, but he's pretty much one of the exceptions. So I like that when you bring up Beyonce, the way you kind of talk about it is that Beyonce has a right to choose. She has a right to live the life that she wants to live. If she wants to get plastic surgery, she's allowed to want to get plastic surgery. If she wants to marry a man who's 12 years older than her, she's allowed to marry a man 12 years older than her. So I like that there's this conception that under the umbrella of feminism, we can all kind of be equal and we can all have a voice in that. If you don't want to marry, if you feel like you don't want to have plastic surgery, we can still live in a world where women still elect to do that. So can we now talk about Beyonce for a bit and talk about essentially how she fought back against some of that extremism? Because I mean, obviously, even though she does have a wide platform and she's always going to have an audience, I mean, I'm assuming it was pretty hard for her to hear attacks, especially for somebody like Bell Hooks, who I'm going to assume to some degree she must have admired.
Yeah, so Bell Hooks, who's a very well-known, recently deceased feminist of the second wave, Black woman as well.
Yeah.
She was a big critic of Beyonce, calling her not just faux feminism. I'm trying to remember the word now, but I mean, real strong.
She called her a terrorist. Yeah.
A terrorist. I mean, it's just like nasty, honestly. And so, here's this eminence, this academic eminence who's got all these impeccable credentials and a list of books as long as her arm, and telling this young, 18, 19-year-old woman, well, you're just, you're not good enough to be a feminist. And I think that's so gross.
Yeah.
I'm a teacher. My God, I would never think to say to my students, well, your generation's understanding is not the proper one of, blah, 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 blah. So and what's so wonderful about Beyonce, who, by the way, I mean, I'm more likely to listen to Beethoven than Beyonce, to be honest. And in fact, pretty much that's always true. But so it's not a musical preference. It's just when you look at historically, who's advancing the marker? She's my face of feminism in that chapter, the person who is doing the things that actually push a whole generation of people in new directions. And part of her direction is, as you just identified so well, Ellen, is that this idea that you get to have a choice. So she had a world tour right after she got married to Jay-Z, whose last name is Carter. And she called it Mrs. Carter's Tour. Mm-hmm. Like, oh my gosh, talk about retrograde, Mrs. Carter. But in the backdrop, she has emblazoned across the backdrop of this huge stage, one word: feminist. So I'm a feminist and I'm decided I'm taking my husband's name. I want to do that. I'm going to do that. And I get to do that. And, you want to criticize me for that. Well, you go ahead. And in a sense, also there's an intersectional element of that comment as well on her part, which is that, for Black men and women in America before abolition, marriage was illegal. There was no marriage. And so you could be married in your mind and heart to somebody, but the person who had enslaved you could at any moment separate you and actually tell you, you have to go with this other person. I'm selling you down here and I need more babies out of you though. So, you're going to be with this guy now. So for Black women, for someone like Beyonce to say, I'm Mrs. Carter, like, good on you. Just live life how you think gives you most freedom and dignity and respect, self-respect, respect of others. And by the way, Beyonce has also always been extraordinarily supportive of gay people and queer people. And she's a big, contributor to organizations which help people, who don't define themselves in traditional ways. So she does it both. She does it all.
Right. And it's such a difficult issue because, I could see it on the other perspective. So with somebody like, what's the topic actually? Is with somebody getting and the topic like plastic surgery. So the idea there is that, well, if we're doing this for the male gaze, doesn't it kind of sully the water for all of us? And it's interesting because in a way it sort of does, because the idea is that, well, yes, if one person gets plastic surgery, one person attempts to look younger. Obviously now it shifts the playing field in some way, and that's always going to be true. But the way I kind of look at it, and maybe this is a naive perspective, obviously I could just be wrong, but I think that in terms of finding men, if that's, let's say, the goal in particular, it is the male gaze, right? I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I don't think that it's just that you have certain men, you have all men who are looking for people to look younger, or all women to look younger. And and all men don't like big breasts, and all men don't like big butts, So my thinking is that, again, I know the environments differ and it's not the same thing everywhere, but I do think that there's a way for everybody to sort of live together, in this kind of, in the proverbial sense of like everybody getting along, where we can have, again, different versions of feminism, where yes, one, let's say, feminist person, man, woman, whomever, this elects to get plastic surgery, and then another one says, well, that's not for me. And then in terms of matching, you'll have one, man or woman or whomever who would say, oh, I don't care, this doesn't bother me, you don't need plastic surgery, I love you the way you are. And then another person might say, well, actually, I like this, I love you, I think you look great, right? And the person says, well, great, this is what I wanted, this is what I paid for. But yeah, it's still but it's so interesting, again, that we're so divided on this issue, and the thinking is that one person could be a bad feminist because they do something like that. And then the question is, like, how do we define bad feminism, and who's to really say what bad feminism is? And we have these waves, right? We have first wave, second wave, third wave, and these kind of thinkers, they've adapted their thinking, and then they've modified the thinking for the environment. And I wonder, do you think that this is kind of what Beyonce in the way is doing it, that she's sort of modifying feminism in the new, or for a new generation in a new way?
Well, I think she is. When I looked at her, not just her life and the way she's lived her life, how she treated other people, which is an important part of, who an individual is, but it's also her lyrics, that what she's actually promoting. And she promotes one of the biggest themes that she's always promoted is the idea of body positivity. Pretty hurts is the name of one of her songs. Being pretty hurts, when people are always shining a spotlight on what you don't have exactly right. You're pretty, but your teeth are they could be different. So she's always been an advocate for body positivity, for the financial independence of women, for equality in relationships between men and women, which is what she explored really in all of her whole corpus of her musical history, her musicology, if you will, but especially in her famous album Lemonade, where she really exposed the infidelity of her own husband, which must have been extraordinarily painful to do, and so brave of her, so brave and kind. Now, she could have just kicked the bum out, but she wants, how do we get on the same page? Do we just all say, well, in that case, go away, never want to see you again? How do we get back to a place where we treat each other with humanity? So, gosh, I think I've now totally lost the question now, because that was such a big one. But,
the new generation, right? So an adapted feminism for a new generation.
Yeah. So the other thing here, I think, is that I do think it's just humate behavior. They say it's primate behavior, that, primates you want to figure out what group you're in, and then what's your status within your group. And so we have different ways of gauging status. And, actually it was John Adams who said something to the effect, this is a paraphrase. He says, there's a natural aristocracy of height, beauty, birth, intelligence, and some people get more than the others. And the job of government is to make sure that the people who have less, are not so utterly unprivileged by that, because it's just the fact, if you're tall, if you're, if you can run fast, and if you're stronger, if you're prettier, if you're handsomer, those are things that just affect us all. So yeah, I always think of it's going back to this thing of plastic surgery. It's a little like Taylorism, which is again an American labor practice of the late 19th century, the kind of speeding up of the lines, of the assembly lines. And if you make, and some people are really good at it, and of course all the other workers are like, I hate you, I hate your guts.
Oh,
Because you do it faster, and now I have to speed up too. So that happens. I mean, I also think that happens to some extent between men as well, certainly, where men sizing themselves up in relation to other men. And, if you put lifts in your shoes, I have to put lift in my shoes, and then it's a race to the top.
Right. And I think what's often lost, and this is, I mean, it's sort of okay because I understand a lot of people don't. So in terms of, let's say, somebody having what's called body dysmorphia in clinical terms, or like an eating disorder, a lot of times you don't really get to peek behind the scenes. So life does look perfect for that person. But so I'm a therapist, so I treat different types of people, narcissism, eating disorders, different personality disorders, whatnot. And so oftentimes, again, what's lost is sort of the suffering that these people have. So yes, on the one hand, you could say, well, who is she to have, bigger breasts, or who is she to have a smaller nose or whatever, right? But it's talking to, in this case, obviously, because we're on the topic of women in plastic surgery, talking to some of these people, you really see how they suffer. And the other thing is also, I think, again, another thing that's lost besides the suffering, but what's also kind of lost behind the scenes is that it's often not good enough. So the person will get plastic surgery and they'll still feel like they're somehow less than. So the thinking sometimes is, well, who is she to look better, or who is she to be this great singer? I love that in your book you touched on how Beyonce actually suffered and struggled with her coworkers, her friends, kind of the blurriness of those relationships, how she struggled with her father, how she struggled with her mother, and seeing the dynamic that they had. So the idea is that nobody here goes without scars. There's nobody who's pain free. So going into, let's say, something specific like an eating disorder, again, often people think, well, oh, she's so lucky, she's so skinny. I've talked to many women with eating disorders, man, they're not that lucky. So a lot of the thinking and a lot of sort of I guess you could call it, the mindset is, it's not so much of I'm better than, even though that's definitely a part of it, but it's a small part of it. One of the major part, or the major kind of preoccupation or obsession is, oh my God, I'm fat. Oh my God, I'm not good enough. Oh my God, my boyfriend, my husband, whomever is never going to love me. These pictures look horrible. These people think I'm a terrible person. These people both think I'm ugly, and they also hate me for trying to be pretty. So a lot of that is, what we talk about or what you talked about, or I hope we're going to talk about in terms of what Beyonce went through. So can we talk about some of her struggles, especially with her bandmates, and also, now that we talked about body positivity, in terms of how she came to accept her body image, and also why she struggled with it, and how she isn't maybe the lucky one as some would conceptualize her as being?
Yeah, well, I think most art comes out of suffering, right?
Right.
They say, the cracks are where the light gets in.
Right.
And if your cracks in your soul is where the light gets in, if everything's easy, you don't ever understand suffering. You're unable to speak as an artist or a writer or anybody to, the great issues that people struggle with. So in her case, she has an interesting situation because her mother is, I don't remember the exact, she's part Black, part white, part Cherokee Indian, part this and part that, part come from Louisiana. Louisiana, as we know, is always Louisiana is a mixture of things.
Right.
And so her mother has green eyes. Her mother has straight hair, I think. And so Beyonce had a mixture of racial backgrounds that really, changed things for her and made it hard for her to, made it hard for her. And so when she was a little kid, she would get teased about having long hair. And for some African-American women, it's very hard to grow your hair beyond a certain length. That's hard for some white women too. So they're not able to, she knew she didn't fit in. And so she would always wear her hair up, and she'd wear things on top of her hair because she was going to get teased about it. And so it was very, very frightening. And so, she was worried about getting beat up. And so when she was a kid, now you think of Beyonce today, she always wore baggy shirts. You see that in a lot of girls, kind of big baggy t-shirts, baggy pants. And she didn't have a lot of friends because she encountered the phenomenon of mean girls, because mean girls is a real thing. And so climbing up on the back of somebody else, is a way that people often who are at the bottom of society get ahead. I mean, Jay-Z, her husband, I mean, I'm sure one thing that must have bonded them was sort of knowing that how hard it is. It's not just the dominant society that you struggle against and with, it's also your own folks, because people are sometimes climbing on each other's backs to get ahead. And so I think that's one reason why, I mean, what I found myself moved by in Beyonce's work is her attitude towards other women. She really has the strong theme of girls need to be nice to girls. And it was really, it's not just finger pointing at men or anything else. It's like, what are we doing? How are we treating each other? And so that I mentioned this one, music video, Pretty Hurts, and it shows girls at a beauty pageant, and she was a beauty pageant as a person, as a kid, and they're literally clawing at each other, trying to get ahead, and it's just the ugliness of that competition within an oppressed group, if you will. And so I was so impressed with Beyonce. Now I've got to tell you, so when you talk about why you select who you select to write on, like I thought for sure I wasn't going to do Susan B. Anthony, who everybody would think is the obvious choice, which is why I wasn't going to do Susan B. Anthony.
Right.
And Beyonce, everybody's like, well, now why would you choose Beyonce? There she is in her low-cut shirt and her high shorts and, sashaying around. And surely that's not feminism. But when you look at both of those women, how representative and how interesting, and also how unusual they were in their generation, what leadership they exercised. Both Susan B. Anthony and Beyonce have exercised extraordinary leadership, moral leadership.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what do you think is the next step in sort of feminist patriotism, in the sense that, like, we've come so far, right, in terms of gender equality in the country, but yeah, I'm curious to think what's sort of the next step to sort of, or what are things that we could do to ensure at least now that gender equality continues, or
at least
evolves.
is maintained as far as it's come, right?
Well, and then evolves. I'm sure there's a next step, right? It could be politically or socially, I suppose.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I do think it's, and this is part of my shtick in the book, I do think it's really important for us all to say we are feminists. I started out the book by talking about, I talked with 3 women colleagues who all were in positions that were only a result of feminism, had positions of status that women would not have had in an earlier generation. I said, so are you guys feminists? I mean, I asked them separately, individually, and they're like, oh, no. I'm like, oh my gosh. I didn't say to them, you are sitting here because of, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and because of Susan B. Anthony, and because of, any number of women, Martha Cotetta, various women who've made it possible for us all to be here. So I think that normalizing, just saying feminism is an important part of our American history. It's an important part of who we are, how we define ourselves as a nation, as a people. 91% of Americans say they do believe that gender equality is very important. So in other words, 91% of Americans are feminists, but we still resist this idea of, well, I don't want to be one of them, like these. And that holds us up from them taking on the next steps. And the next steps are really important ones. I mean, we really need to keep pushing on representation in government, in the sense that, for example, I mentioned a few minutes ago, because it just crossed my mind the other day, and I thought, well, what if it were like Kamala Harris and like Nikki Haley and blah, blah, blah. Who knows what will happen. But right now there's this mantra of, well, a woman can't get elected. We tried that once. Yeah, we tried it once. She actually won the popular vote, but a woman can't get elected. So wait a minute. The lesson of Hillary Clinton is don't put a woman up. But that is what pundits are saying. I mean, New York Times, Washington Post, go read some articles, friends, you'll find that. And so it's very important that this is not about payback. It's about becoming who we want to be. And we also know that one of the reasons why democracy in general works better than all the alternatives, as Winston Churchill said, he said it was the worst of all systems except for all of the others that have been tried. And the reason for that is because the more heads and more perspectives you have on a problem, the more likely you are in general, in the aggregate, to get good solutions. Sociologists have found this again and again. That's one of the problems with, doing yes men, the kind of like, I don't want to hear any input, because then you just get your own cockamamie ideas.
Mhm.
Alan can tell you better than I can that when people stay only in their own heads, it's not always a good place to be.
Yeah. And even now, this reminds me of kind of Megyn Kelly's incident, or just the experiences that she had. So it was interesting that when she goes on the late night talk show, she says, well, I don't want to kind of brand myself as a feminist, trying to walk that sort of thin line or that tightrope between, in this case, sort of republicanism, or I mean, maybe it's unfair to call it that, but let's say chauvinism. And then obviously, what feminism actually is. And clearly she is a feminist all throughout. But then finally, when there's this sort of breaking point, I mean, I don't even know, would she label herself a feminist now, but it seems like she probably would have, or at least would at this point. So my thinking is, what's so interesting about that is, now going back to Fox News and that story, is that in order to protect themselves, it seems like what was happening is, maybe Gretchen Carlson did this too, where they kind of disavow the label of feminist or feminism, and they say to themselves and to other people, they say, well, we don't need these labels. These labels aren't important, which is obviously not true, because I mean, the labels kind of signal to other people what actually is important. And it also signals to them that it's not fair for a person, in this case, a group of men, to take that label away from us just because they kind of sully it with these connotations that don't necessarily belong there. So with, again, going back to Megyn Kelly, I love that as the story kind of progresses and the trajectory of it changes, we now see this person going from, well, I'm not much of a feminist, but I kind of believe or subscribe to some of these ideals, to, well, I actually now kind of am. And I can see how sort of the branding of it is really important. And I could see, and we go into the story about her linking up with other people, reaching out to other people, uniting with them and saying, hey guys, if we kind of, I know she didn't say this specifically, but I think the kind of messages is, if we label ourselves feminist, we could kind of work together to overcome or override this oppressive system.
Yeah, I think, it is easy to say, and we all do, oh, I don't want to label this or that. But, we have the 7 deadly sins and the 7 cardinal virtues. And we use a word like truth to distinguish it from falsehood. A truthful person from a liar. So we care about words. Words are how we get around in the world and navigate the world. So what has happened is that there was actually very deliberate effort to undermine the word feminism, which is just craziness. But it's by people who want to protect their own position. And even though the word feminist wasn't around at the time of John Adams was one of the first. He said, when Abigail said, could you remember the ladies when you write the laws? And he said, I cannot but laugh. And then he went and said, oh, the enemy's trying to stir up rabble rousers of all kinds. And they're encouraging enslaved people. He didn't say enslaved, he just slaves and, Indians and renegados of all types to rally against the revolutionary government, which, by the way, now sounds kind of good, doesn't it? But back then, he thought that was a terrible thing. So we tend to put down, it's an ad hominem attack is always the easiest and cheapest insult, right? To get at your point by saying, and you're ugly too. So, by the way, which was always also said about feminists, and you're ugly. So that actually just fits. But I think that, I don't know if Megyn Kelly has ever come back and said, yes, I am a feminist, but I think probably when pressed, now she might. But there's a penalty to pay. That's the problem. There's a penalty to pay for saying it. But, I think that the women in the Republican Party, which, by the way, was the first party of feminism, Republican Party endorsed the Equal Rights Amendment before the Democratic Party. It was the party of Lincoln, remember? So it was the part that was against slavery, not the Democrats, who were the party of slavery. So they all switched places over the course of a century, but still, it's really important for Republican women of all women and Republican men of all men to stand up and say to the bullies in their party, who are trying to harm their own party, no, these are our values and we are fighting for those values. So that's always the thing. And in any political party, it has to police itself. And if you police by just giving away to bullies, then you really are, you're signing your own death warrant.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so interesting how for men, a lot of us are afraid of using that term. So I had a conversation with one of our mutual friends, and this was a while ago. So he doesn't have this necessarily, he doesn't subscribe to this anymore. So he was like, well, I'm not a feminist, right? And I'm like, okay, so what are you then? And he said, well, I believe that women should have equal rights. I believe they should have equal pay. I'm like, okay, cool, bro, you're a feminist. And he's like, well, I don't want to use that term. And so, but it doesn't make any sense, right? So it's like, it's so interesting that this group of guys, again, men co-opted this term and said, and made it into a dirty thing that now we're not able to kind of signal to each other that, right, this is what I believe in, this is why
That's so, Leon, what you're saying right now is important because that's also why I wanted to highlight that that definition of feminism earlier, right? Because there's that idea that comes up to your mind when you hear that word. It feels like it's like a loaded word, but I'm so happy that we're talking about it on the podcast, because that's going to sort of elucidate this idea that it's actually way more complex. It's way more nuanced. There's something else going on there when you actually like identify as a feminist. It's not like this idea of like just this thing of anti-men comes to mind, or whatever starts to come to mind.
Right.
It's like, no, I'm interested in equality. I'm interested in women earning as much as men. I'm interested in women having a strong political voice. If we're a meritocracy, then if this woman is saying that something that is totally beyond what this competitive, like whatever her competitor is, like if it's a man, if what she's saying is better than what he's saying, that idea is stronger than his idea, let's go with it. Who cares if she's a woman or a man, right? And yeah, so I'm happy we're talking about.
Yes,
that's
feminism
my
doesn't
point.
have to be a dirty word, is what we're saying. And the fact that it is a dirty word is literally by those who are complicit in making it so for a nefarious reason or purpose.
Yeah,
absolutely. And we can chart that historically. And part of that is that sort of natural human fear of change. And so my book is about feminism, but it is also about anti-feminists, because in every generation, in Abigail Adams' generation, there were women of eminence who said, oh, well, women should have no rights. And that happened in the 19th century. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Angelina Grimke. A lot of people encountered those women who said, oh, no, women have too many rights already. So in every generation where there's been forward progress, there have been people who've also said, oh, we don't need that progress. And if we have it, it'll undermine the family, et cetera. And so I do think that it is very, very important that we just understand that it's a very inclusive term. People tend to think it's an exclusive term, like there are all these fine points you got to match up with, and if I don't match up with that, well, I'm never calling myself a feminist because I don't believe in blah 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 blah. Whereas rather, like democracy, it's a very inclusive value, and people who believe in democracy will have very different ideas, whether because of their gender or their race or the part of the country they live in, or whether they're poor or they're rich or they're from the all kinds of reasons why we are very diverse people. And one of those is by gender, but we have certain values in common. And that's why I think now, especially when we feel so divided, that's the moment where we also have to say, but okay, so what do we still have in common? Because we don't want to go to hell in a handbasket, right?
Yeah, and I love that. And as we start wrapping up, this is going to be my kind of final point, especially going into this is interesting because it's sort of we can kind of map it to your book, because this is the last part of your chapter of the last chapter. We're talking about the Larry Nassar case. So I wonder, do you think that if, let's say, feminism were a more broadly used term, if, let's say, more people identified as feminists, more people, going back to the idea of signaling, right? We were able to quickly signal to each other, well, I'm a feminist, you're a feminist, this is sort of our group or our team. This is kind of, our idealism or kind of our ideology, better yet. So do you think that it would have been easier for the gymnasts in that case? And it's a lengthy story, obviously, not to get into it too much, but in terms of how the gymnasts responded, do you think if they knew that there were more people potentially on their side, that if there were more feminists in the world, would they have felt safer coming forward with those accusations?
Yeah, so the Olympic gymnasts who were abused. Now, by the way, I think that's such an interesting point. It's one doctor and it's 500 girls and young women. So how many men are bad guys? We don't know. This is one doctor who assaults 500 individuals. So it just tells you how often people who are criminal can get away with so much. So, Abigail Adams was right. Most men don't think this way and wouldn't do such grotesque things. But that's why it's important that the men who don't think that way stand up and be counted. We women really count on you. And some of the best feminists have always been men. Frederick Douglass, you could write people think of Frederick Douglass as an abolitionist, but Frederick Douglass was one of the most important American feminists of all time. And, if I hadn't other people I was trying to focus on instead, I could have done him easily. Similarly, Susan B. Anthony was one of the most important American abolitionists. She was the one who organized the petition drive behind the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and put the Emancipation Proclamation into actual law in America. So we tend to, think, oh, we think of so-and-so as this and so-and-so as that, but really there's a lot of overlap here. So what would happen? Would the Olympic gymnasts have felt safer? I think so. I think the more we all, first of all, come forward with stories of abuse and say that's not normal, that's not right, a girl might hear of something like that and go, oh, so that this thing that's happening to me, I could say something about it without having the letter I stitched on my blouse for the rest of my life, or being thought of as being the cause of the crime. So I think that feminism would help us. I really would. Or take an example, I always thought was so grotesque when Donald Trump was a candidate. And, the stories came out about his groping women in his own USA, America, the USA pageant, the alternate to the, Miss America pageant, Miss USA. And also his blatant, his admitted comment, I can grope women, I can grab their pussies because I'm a celebrity, and you get to if you're a celebrity. I think if more women, Republican women, had said, wait, we all know, of course, we're all feminists, so how does that stack up? But if you don't have that sense of category in your mind, you might think, well, can I really object to that too strenuously? Are people going to think I'm a feminist if I object to that? Am I going to get into trouble with some other part of my constituency? So we can all say, listen, we really believe in equality. Now, how does that fit with abortion rights? How does that fit with, sexual assault? How do we measure behaviors if we understand what our basic values are? And it'll just give us a better place to have conversations about these things.
Yeah. And to end with a quote from your book again, I would say something along, I'm going to kind of reframe it or restate it. So we're not looking to condemn, we're looking to redeem. So I love that. All right, Alan, final questions for Lisa before we wrap up.
Yes. If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course, buy the book, where can we do that?
Well, I'm going to tell you, my full name is Elizabeth, but I was never called Elizabeth ever as a kid. You know me as Lisa, but it's Elizabeth Cobbs. So, elizabethcobbs.com, look for me on Twitter, Elizabeth_Cobbs, Instagram, but of course, all the regular outlets. And the book is published by Harvard. You can buy it from them or Amazon or Barnes & Noble or, whatever. Give me a shout out. I don't hide.
Absolutely. Lisa, thank you so much for coming on. This was such an excellent episode.
Well, thank you. I loved it too.
Absolutely. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. That was awesome.
Very great.
So everyone, if you want to follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitter, where it Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe,
hit the bell on YouTube.
And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.